we're going to do now kind of fits into it in a nice way. Thanks for the intro. My name's David. Excited to take part in the session today. I'm actually trying something a little bit new today, so I hope the experiment goes well. I don't have time to do a 5-second experiment. This will be a half-hour experiment of sorts. I'm actually going to start with kind of a faux pas, let's call it. I think the worst way to start a talk is with a disclaimer, so let's do it anyway. Today's talk is called Leading Through Change, Building Self-Learning Organizations. And I'm actually going to tell you what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about organizational models that allow to build organizations that upskill and reskill self-learning organizations. I'm not going to talk about B Corps, holacracy, teal organizations, beyond budgeting, participatory organizations, name drop, name drop, name drop. If you want to talk org design, maybe read Aaron Bignon's book, for example, called Brave New Work. So important disclaimer. Instead, during this talk, I'm actually going to try to change your mindset on something, even if it's only for like 5% of people listening. I'm going to try to convince you that investing in learning for yourself, but also for your teams, the teams you lead, and your organizations as a whole, is actually the highest ROI project, company strategy, or activity that you can undertake. So I'm going to repeat that one because this is not common sort of knowledge or commonly accepted, that investing in learning capabilities, building capabilities in your teams is the highest, most predictable long-term ROI investment that an organization can make, and I'll also prove it along the way. Now, we believe you should be doing more of it. You should be investing more into it, both for yourself, for your teams, and for your organization as a whole. And that too often, it's an afterthought, or we think that it will happen sort of organically or naturally, or that it will happen by hiring the right people. Now, after I attempt to convince you, I'm going to try to underline why we don't invest more into it. So what are some of the cognitive biases that stop us from investing more in learning for ourselves or our teams? And I'm going to challenge you on some steps to actually get started. And I'll show you how to run a first experiment around learning to try to measure the impact and the ROI. Essentially making steps towards building what we call a learning organization, which are basically the most powerful, resilient, innovative companies in the world in terms of adapting and thriving within a context of change. We'll actually start with a short introduction of who I am and what it is we do at Growth Tribe. So I'm the co-founder of a company and currently leading growth, and we're called Growth Tribe. We basically try to elevate humanity through learning. We used to be a consulting firm. We used to also build a lot of software. We used to be really focused on growth. And now we've decided that elevating humanity through learning seems to really work, and organizations. Now, in longer terms, that means that we're dedicated to keeping organizations competitive and humans competitive through learning digital capabilities, specifically on the digital side. We have a special focus on making learning relevant, linked to business objectives, and of course, enjoyable. And we work with companies that want to serve customers better. And you were talking about this centricity before, in a more agile manner. And we focus on 5 main clusters of hard and soft skills that we believe are the most important for the digital world. And every company has a different taxonomy, but this is our taxonomy around data and digital, mindset, innovation, and the customer experience. We've identified these as the 5 most important clusters for the sort of digital world that we live in. We have offices throughout Europe, and we provide online and offline learning solutions. And who do we work for? So maybe if you can identify yourselves with some of these logos, we work for startups and scale-ups. And currently we have a really strong focus on the enterprise. So we're transforming ourselves into a scale-up or enterprise learning partner. But we also have sort of public courses that anyone can participate in online and take a 12-week data analytics course, for example, a 12-week customer centricity course. So let's get into the actual subject matter. Let's actually get started. I'm actually going to start with one of my favorite all-time mental models. This is a mental model that I almost have tattooed onto my brain to help me know every single day, I'm a bit obsessive with this, if I'm focusing on the right thing at any given time. It's called the productivity pyramid. It sounds a bit cocky, but it's kind of a nice model. I actually prefer to call it the return on energy pyramid, ROE pyramid. Basically, it's quite simple. It breaks down a day, a week, a month, or a year into four types of activities based on the return on investment of these activities or the return on energy of these activities. As we all know, our scarcest resource is time. We have limited time. Teams, companies have limited time and energy. And the question is, how are we using this time and this energy? Now, the top of the pyramid is what we call negative ROE, negative return on energy. It's activities that have negative ROI, that are detrimental. And the second part is what we call, positive ROE, but it's low euro per hour value, or pound, or rupee, or whatever currency you're in. The ROE is positive, but it's low. And the third part is high ROI activities, high ROI. They have high euro per hour value. And typically, we're quite good at allocating our time based on these three different parts. We're not perfect, but we're quite good. However, we don't seem to allocate enough energy to the bottom part, the bottom section. And the final bottom part is what we call high lifetime value activities. We're talking massive gains, really large exponential gains, but often on the much longer term. I'm not saying everybody's bad at this, but it's typically 90%, 10%. And actively, for example, fostering key relationships. That's one example. This is also, by the way, why many couples don't make it. It's through lack of time investment, and it sort of degrades little by little over time. You also have things like working on breakthrough ideas, spending time to actually sit and think with no distractions, moments that yield those 0.01% of overall ideas, but that have 50% of returns. Or, for example, moments of deep work, as outlined by Cal Newport in his book, Deep Work. How much time have you as a person or your teams actually dedicated to these high lifetime value activities this week, for example, or this month? And what we've seen, what we believe, and what we try to prove through data more and more is that the biggest one here is actually learning. Learning has one of the highest, if not the highest, lifetime value you can imagine from a professional point of view. Now, why is that? It's actually quite simple. As you all know, we live in a knowledge economy, living through the fifth industrial revolution, the one of ICT. And in a knowledge economy, well, knowledge is the greatest resource to have. It's pretty obvious. And knowledge is, of course, achieved through learning. With more knowledge, we make better decisions, you, your teams, your organization, and more creative decisions every single day. In a knowledge economy, learning and thinking are the single best long-term investments you can make for yourself and for your career. And you were mentioning it in the talk before. It'll enable you to leverage the technology rather than having the technology leverage you, maybe at some Black Mirror point in the future. And it might seem super obvious, yet after going through higher education, the majority of us grossly underestimate in learning. Personally, our teams and the organization. The EU, European average participation in learning for adults is a little bit, tiny little bit above 10%. My opinion, in this fast changing world, it should be closer to 80%. Now, you might be thinking, I spend time learning, my teams do, but let me ask you, what percentage of your time do you actually spend on deliberate learning? Look back at the past day, the past week, the past month, or the past year. And I'm not talking about learning on the job by osmosis, right? I'm talking about deliberate learning of a new capability or of a new skill. Skills and capabilities that will expand your cognitive bandwidth, that will open growth options in your brain that didn't exist before. Ones that will, improve your everyday decision making in this knowledge economy that we talked about, or even random pieces of knowledge that might have nothing to do with your job, but that will expand your cognitive bandwidth. At the end, we're really talking about improving this core skill, which is decision making, which we do every single day, thousands of times every day. There was a report by Bersin. So Bersin's considered like the godfather of workplace learning, basically. And he found that the average person spent 24 minutes a week for deliberate learning. So if we look at the average number of hours worked in your country, it actually sort of rounds off to being less than 1% of a sort of career is spent on learning or deliberate learning. Less than 1% spent on such a high lifetime value activity. Now, once again, How much time have you or your teams actually spent on deliberate learning this week or this month? For me, this is absolutely baffling, and we're on a mission to try to solve this 1%. Even if we can just double it, that's already sort of a good progress. Now, once again, we live in a knowledge economy that's driven currently by tech, by technology, information technology, and technology in general. Now, the tools and knowledge at our disposal are actually greater than ever. However, a gap is formed since we can't seem, as humans and as organizations, to keep up. You'll see that if you look at the World Economic Forum reports, productivity has actually been going down for the past 10 years. But like any huge gap, it's actually an opportunity. And from a purely capitalistic frame of mind, you don't need to fill this gap personally or for your organization 100%. You just need to be a little bit better than the competition. That's typically how our capitalist society works. You need to be a bit better or a lot better than the competition. Now, why do we underspend on learning, on deliberate learning, on building capabilities? Well, part of it, not all of it, but part of it is because we don't see the return on investment. It's because of the same cognitive bias that stops us, for example, from taking action on climate change, for example. It's called temporal bias. It's also known as the urgency bias. It was outlined with quite some detail in Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, for example, or in Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational. Now, we actually discount the impact of things on the longer term. That's why we tend to eat too much sugar, for example, or smoke cigarettes, or have too much alcohol, which we call borrowing happiness from the next day sometimes. And we focus more on short-term gains. Temporal discounting explains many of these sort of unhealthy habits that we have as humans, but also as organizations. And despite having extremely healthy intentions, in short, we tend to focus on small, short gains versus huge, long-term gains. And those who can fight this bias tend to win. It's also why conscientiousness and long-term planning seems to create better careers for people. And it's a personality trait that is highly correlated with professional success, even more highly correlated than IQ or intelligence. And this bias we have at the individual level. We also have it at the organizational level. Organizations greatly underspend on their people's capabilities and talent for the reasons that I talked about. The ROI on the bottom line, on release cycle times, on product development, on organizational performance, on innovation, on growth, on overperformance, on even on bottom line growth, have been proven and demonstrated again and again and again to be linked to this capability of building learning organizations or of individual learning. Take this study, for example. I think that's one of my favorite recent ones. So it's MIT and Deloitte that did a recent study of digital transformation with 4,300 executives. The most successful, fast-growing, digitally enabled companies are differentiated by one key thing. They've transformed the way individuals and organizations learn new capabilities. And this means learning all the time, not just once a year. And amongst these highest performing companies, I hope I don't get the stats wrong, 73% of employees in these companies are updating their skills every 6 months because the shelf life of skills has greatly decayed. We call it skills decay. And 44%, I think it was 44, are updating them continuously. That's almost half. In other words, I had the stats there. In other words, today's successful companies are those who learn fast, learn well, and learn all the time. And the literature on the ROI of learning is heavily and well documented. I can share you the links of all this after the talk. However, paradoxically, most organizations still grossly underinvest. Less than 3% of Fortune 1000 companies have HR or learning even on the board. Mid-size and large organizations, they spend less than 714 euros per year per employee on learning. According to CEB research, 1 in 10 companies have a true culture around learning, and then there's a bunch more stats where this came from. Most CEOs declare not knowing what the impact of learning or learning efforts actually is, and that's also one of the key problems. Now, I'll actually throw it back to you as humans, maybe as leaders, as a team leader, as a manager, business unit leader, executive, or just someone participating inside an organization. When's the last time you built a business case around learning? Just a business case. If you have, congratulations. Probably you haven't, and data shows that the grand majority of you have never actually built this type of business case. And it doesn't even have to be an entire business case. When's the last time you built an experiment card, just a small experiment around learning, personal for your team or for the organization, where learning is the key growth driver, even from a financial point of view? Let's put it this way. If we look at an organization, it's kind of a living organism. And if you take the analogy further, if you look at the molecular cellular level of the organization, well, the molecular level, it's actually you, it's me, it's all of us. And none of the tech, the tooling, the processes, or even the strategy, and this is the stuff I used to consult on, but I've realized that none of this is possible to implement or to excel at without the sort of bottom of the Maslow's pyramid of needs, let's say, without the capabilities and the talent. But we don't focus enough on updating the learning and capabilities that allow for new product development, services, business models, financial performance, refining core business, et cetera, et cetera. And imagine for a second an organization where each individual component, each human, was a lifelong learner capable of making better decisions based on superior and updated knowledge. An organization, basically from a bottom-up approach, is self-learning, that organically adapts and learns. That company becomes not only self-learning, but it also becomes organically self-driving. And self-learning, self-driving organizations adapt better and faster within context in which they evolve. And of course, it's not that perfect, but it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be a little bit better, a little bit faster than others. Now, at the individual level, we talk about the compound returns of learning, since learning leads to better decision making. And if you know anything about compound interest rates, for example, you'll understand the massive returns it has on the long term. Now, imagine that this spread across your team, your department, or the entire organization. Imagine the impact there. So what's blocking people from within organizations from spending more time on learning, time and investment? They should be doing this on the job, right? Or during their spare time. Well, actually wrong. It's an organization's role, it's a leader's role to enable this learning, to invest in learning, to build these capabilities, but it's also an opportunity. And there's a few blockers you need to know about so that you can help remove them if you believe in this. And the first one has to do with the presence or a lack of a growth mindset within the organization. So growth mindset's a concept that was studied and coined by Carol Dweck over 30 years ago. It's been closely studied at the organizational level. And funnily enough, and it has to do with continuous learning. And funnily enough, it's not usually a problem within the execution side of the organization. It's usually, but not always, but usually lacking in the higher echelons of the company. Sometimes we like to call it, it's a bit negative, the permafrost of the fixed mindset within the company, with leadership, where the capabilities that they have and that they acquired and make them big, important people have actually decayed faster than they'd like to admit. And maybe on this note, it's time to look in the mirror. What behavior as a leader, if you are a leader, but in some way I believe everyone is a leader, do I demonstrate? What type of culture do I have? Now, the key characteristics of growth mindset teams have been studied, and I'm laying them out here on this slide. Valuing status over potential, for example, rigid planning versus experimentation, or also, more likely to hire from the outside to buy talent rather than to hire and promote from the inside. Those are the characteristics of fixed mindset people and organizations versus growth mindset organizations. So maybe good internal audit to do or a good sanity check. Now, the second thing we see is what we like to, well, actually, it's not the second thing. It's more like there's this notion of the T-shaped leader, where it might also be time to look at what your capabilities are. Are they up to par with the modern digital world? Sure, you can manage a profit and loss account, but can you talk data? I mean, sure. Do you understand, for example, the different applications of, I don't know, supervised learning versus unsupervised learning? This is what I like to tell leaders a lot of the time when I'm talking to boards, for example. Do you know how to design an experiment? Do your teams know how to design an experiment? Do you truly understand digital channels? I'm still amazed that, sometimes I meet boards where everybody can understand the basics of finance, but they still don't understand data and digital. I'm like, how can you still be on the board of this company or on the leadership of the company if you still don't understand digital? And typically the two big ones we see are issues with data and digital channels. These are the two biggies, I would say. Second blocker, apart from the growth mindset, is typically time dedication and incentives to learn. Against popular myth, you don't actually learn most of your new capabilities on the job. You need to make deliberate time for learning. And forward-thinking companies create time and actually invest in their people. They invest in their learning. Just pulled a few examples, like AT&T's company-wide reskilling program, like Airbnb's Analytics Academy, or like many of the local examples we help drive. So for example, we're building Albert Heijn digital academies, finance frontrunner academies, this insurance company's customer centricity academy, or the Philips University. Companies that are integrating learning inside their organization and actually investing there. But even if you're not a large company like this, you can also start at the team level. Take a part of your ad budget, take a part of your hiring budget, take a part of that consulting budget, that strategic budget, and invest it into learning and try to build a use case. Because by doing that, you're embedding these capabilities within the DNAs of the teams, and they will take 2% better decisions every single day, and that comes to compound returns on the longer term. In all of these cases, leaders clearly made dedicated time and budget available for learning. And it's win-win. It's a win for the business, and it's a win for the team members. Let's talk about the third obstacle. Possibly the biggest one of them all is the paradox of choice. Learning doesn't come with a manual, unfortunately. It's kind of like the toothpaste aisle, which toothpaste should I be using? I also like it to compare learning to finding a diamond in a bag of broken glass. What should I be learning? And how deep should I go? And that's why educators like us are still necessary, to curate what you should be learning and how deep you should go, because that's really difficult. So it's actually your responsibility, I guess, if you're in a leading role, for example, to help answer this question. What should each function be learning next, and how deep should they go? And this is actually the hardest one to solve, and I'll give you some steps on how to figure this out in a few seconds. So I'd actually challenge you. Here's my challenge to you, because I like these talks to be actionable and that there's something for you to do afterwards. I encourage you to build this into an experiment if you believe in this. A mini business case of sorts. So for example, your experiment could be, I want to invest in making our teams, I don't know, more customer centric, more data driven to better serve customers. Then you write your hypothesis. I believe that by investing in experimentation, customer centricity, and like data capabilities, we can increase revenue and engagement on product X. To verify that, we're going to outline business objectives, create a clear learning path, and upskill the team over the next 6 weeks. We're going to invest some time and money into learning. And what will we measure? Well, we're going to measure, here you would list a bunch of key KPIs linked to your business objectives: revenue increase, the supply chain optimization, engagement increase, whatever KPIs are linked to your business objectives. We are right if, and this was a successful experiment, if we gather learnings within the first month and we increase our revenue, our engagement, we hit our KPIs, some line in the sand. You can also think about, of course, what possible blockers you might come across: lack of budget, temporal bias, wink, wink. This experiment card doesn't need to be perfect. And in the end, your learning program is basically just the outcome of this little experiment. I'm just describing a small pilot. Now, when you think about what you need to do next, this is what I'd like you to do. After you've built this experiment card, I'd like you to start with the company objectives. For example, like I said, be more data-driven to increase profitability, or be more customer-centric to engage customers. Typically linked to your global strategy or something you're doing at the moment. Then think about how those are linked to your business objectives. How are those company objectives linked to your business objectives? So for data-driven, it might be like driving sales by focusing on profitable channels, or using historical data to predict lifetime value. Something simple or something complicated. For customer centricity, it could be increasing conversions on key products. I don't know. Now comes the interesting part. How are these business objectives linked to behaviors that you'd like to see within the team or the company? So how are these business objectives linked to a change in behavior that you'd like to see within the organization? Maybe you want people to start, yourself or your teams, to start taking more data-informed decisions, have shorter meetings, less discussions, and more insights, for example. Or maybe actively conduct better, faster user research. Or maybe you'd like the behavior of the team to be taking more risks. And then you start linking it to learning objectives. So think about how those behavioral objectives translate into learning objectives. What could people learn to do better? Like on the data side, having a stronger grasp of analytics, using business intelligence tools, getting better at data visualization and data storytelling to communicate to other departments. That's a huge one, by the way. The data is already in the company, but the data teams aren't able to translate that to other companies. Data visualization is a huge skill to invest in, and communication. On the other customer-centric side, maybe knowing how to design an effective experiment in this agile world of experimentation, running user research or analyzing experiments. And then finally, the last part, that's the last part. And unfortunately, it tends to be the part that people begin with when they want to implement learning, like, oh, let's just sign everybody up to Udemy or to LinkedIn Learning. What tools and methods do I want to mix to reach these learning and behavioral changes? And sky's the limit there. There's so much available, from in-person learning, online courses, coaching, mentoring, books, virtual classrooms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's quite easy to curate this when you actually put time into it. And it's a lot of what we do also as a company. It's quite an amazing exercise to do, and I hope you'll give it a shot. Small tip, I would actually focus on the fast skills first if you want to invest in this rather than the slower skills. They're both equally important, but skills like data analytics and digital, they tend to have a shorter term ROI than the softer skills that training is typically linked with. With fast skills, you can start applying those skills or capabilities the very next day and have results within like a sprint, for example. And now you wouldn't accept a treatment from a doctor without getting diagnosed first, without running some tests. Well, it's the same thing with learning. We need to find out where the gaps are with you as an individual or within your organization. We call that a capability scan. You can do this yourselves with some interviews or some gut feeling. Where do we lack from a capability point of view? We've actually built a tool that does this. It's an assessment where you get a report a little bit like this. Unfortunately, it's not totally self-service, but I've shared a link here. If you're interested in running this on yourselves or on your teams, we can help run that for you. At the moment, we only have the tool for data capabilities and digital capabilities and marketing capabilities for those three, for nothing else. So if you don't have much time, you can just sign up here on this URL, and then we'll see if you could be a fit, and we'll try to run the capability scan for you. It's basically like a diagnosis of current capability levels and where we believe, linked to your company strategy, you might want to fix it. Yeah, and then in the end, I think I'm a bit over time, but typically the goal is to increase the score on those key capabilities that you want to be able to improve, linked to those behavioral objectives within your organization. Then we can see how those capabilities evolved halfway through the learning journeys, for example. So let's do a short recap of what we've covered. A little bit over time. We've talked about the ROI of learning that is huge and long-term. Invest in yourself and in the organization. I challenge you to launch an experiment around building capabilities. I really do, even if it's a small, scrappy one, to create dedicated time in money and in time to learning, to be creative, to experiment, and to combine knowledge and hopefully adopt a growth mindset. I really want to try to convince you that self-learning organizations also become self-driving organizations. And it's not just about changing the organizational structure. It's not just about becoming, a more agile organization from an operating system or organizational structure point of view. It's also about the mindset. We like to say that mindset eats strategy for breakfast. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And then if you're interested in this, begin with the company objectives and link those to behavioral objectives. And then you'll be building a business case. If you want to audit your current capabilities, start with a simple scan. Just fill out this URL over here, growth.ac/RTI. And then if we're a fit, we can accompany you there. And if it's not a fit, at least you'll already have sort of an audit of how yourself or how your teams are doing. Fantastic. Thanks so much for your attention. I'm a bit over time because I see it's 11:32, so I don't really know if we have time for questions or not. If we do, great. If we don't, you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn, for example, and I can answer them.
Hey, David, yeah, I guess we just have maybe time for one question. The question essentially is that you spoke about organizations and the graph that you showed where there is a learning or skills decay that takes place within a very, very short period of time.
Yes.
And we also see in many cases organizations have not necessarily woken up to the need to large scale invest in individuals in their skilling. As an individual, instead of getting caught in that scenario, what would be your advice to them, for individuals who are working in different companies, to be able to start self-skilling themselves? What would be one or two tips that they can start working on upgrading themselves?
Yeah, really good question. So basically, you're in an organization, and the organization's not making time or investment in this learning. I mean, we have public courses and corporate courses, and a lot of the people who come to the public courses, it's exactly what they're doing. So they're actually investing themselves into their career. So it's investing your personal time and your personal budget into those personal capabilities. So it's outside of work hour or outside of work time. And then there's tips and tricks that we have on how to convince your manager, how to convince a little bit the leadership within the organization. But of course, those take much longer time. I would say from an individual's perspective, what's really difficult is to find out what should I be learning next and how deep should I go. And you can use the exact same sort of little chart I shared, which we'll be sharing later, to do that on yourself. What are my like personal life goals and life objectives? Okay, what's a behavioral change I'd like to see for myself based on those life goals or objectives? And what are the key capabilities linked to those personal behavioral objectives? And it doesn't even have to be linked to the digital world. It could be also about leadership skills, for example, or communication skills. But it's really having this, and we're quite process driven because we're quite blue and analytical. I say we, us here at Growth Tribe, but it's really having that process driven way of setting up those goals. And then like learning's available everywhere. I love technology for this. Like all of the learning of the world is available at the tip of at your fingertips. So it's jumping on YouTube and starting to curate your own sort of learning path in a way. But I would really argue that the number one step you need to make at the moment is create a dedicated time for this. 3 hours a week. Start with this. 3 hours, fully focused, dedicated learning. 85% of people don't do this. 15% do. I think it was 10 or 15% within Fortune 1000 companies. I can't remember the percentage, but most people don't. Create dedicated time is step number one in your actual agenda. Block it in there.
I think that's actually an excellent tip, and you're absolutely spot on. Even before you start looking at what do you need to learn or get yourself skilled about, I think it's putting that dedicated effort of time, that's key to self development. So thank you so much, David. As usual, it's been very very knowledgeable, and yeah, and that
Super.
would yeah. So with that, we bring closures to this particular session. So ladies and gentlemen, that was David Arnoux. As he said, he is on LinkedIn. You can reach out to him. We will put our contacts of his contact details as well. So get in touch with us if you want to speak with David as well. So we'll be more than happy to make that connection. So once again, David, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. It was great. Thanks.